These two themes are running in and out of each other, and you get horrendous words of judgment and strong statements of God's righteousness in the Old Testament, and you get incredible words of patience and kindness and mercy in the Old Testament, and you wonder, what in the world? How can he be like this? Where does it all come together? What's the common thing? How does it? And suddenly the music comes together in the cross.
If you've ever read the Old Testament and thought, how can God be this merciful here and that severe there? You're not alone. I'm Dan Kruver. In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper takes us to the one place where God's justice and mercy meet, and the music of the Old Testament finally makes sense. This teaching was originally delivered at Bethlehem Baptist Church on February 26, 1992.
Tonight, we begin chapter 6. We won't finish chapter 6, and then next time we'll probably not spend the whole time next week on chapter 6. So let's begin with question number 1. What is askew, out of kilter, in the picture of God and His ways that has emerged so far in our study? Or another way to ask this is to say, what's the apparent schizophrenia in God that we are confronted with in the Bible? Running through this book so far has been God's passion to uphold His glory. He loves His glory. He hates the spurning and disdain of His glory. He is opposed to forces that trample His glory in the dirt. God is righteous. He is ultimately and unswervingly committed to His honor and His worth. He cannot be an idolater. He cannot be half-hearted about what is infinitely valuable, namely Himself. Now that's half the schizophrenia. What's the other half? What did God do that seems wholly out of character with such a passion for His glory in the last chapter? Making us into saints. Now you not only move in the right direction, but you give part of the solution to the problem I'm trying to create. He did something for us. The last chapter was all about election, and basically what we said there was that God from all eternity freely and unconditionally has chosen a people for Himself. And as we know these people, they're all sinners. They're all sinners. Now, to get at why that's a schizophrenia, we have to define sin. And if you have your Bibles, I really want to nail down for you why sin is such a problem in this matter of God's choosing sinners for Himself while He loves His glory so much, while He esteems His honor so highly. Now everybody knows the key text on sin is Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Now literally, we need to ask what fall short means. All have sinned, and that sin involves falling short of the glory of God. Now, here's something it surely does not mean. That there's glory in the balcony, God's glory, and I am supposed to be as glorious as God, and I try and I blop into the first pew here and fall short of being like God. Now, I don't think that's what it means, because I'm never intended to be as glorious as God. So to fall short of God's glory doesn't mean that I'm not as glorious as God. The answer to what it does mean, I think, and this is a little memory device you can use, I think Romans 1:23 is the best explanation of Romans 3:23. 1:23 and 3:23, can remember it that way. Look at Literally, the verb is, for all have sinned and lack the glory of God. Lack the glory of God. Which doesn't help too much until you realize in what sense we lack it. Do we lack it in that we were supposed to be like him and have it, or lack it in the sense that is described here in this crazy exchange that was made by sinners in Romans 1, starting at verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds and animals and reptiles. Now that's a description of what I think it means to be a sinner. We were offered the glory of God to enjoy it and reflect it through that enjoyment and that faith. God created Adam and Eve to be reflectors of his glory through enjoyment and faith and hope, and out of that, obedience. And what has happened is a colossal exchange, according to Romans 1:23. They took that glory, they examined it, and they said, I don't prefer this. And they put it aside, they turned around, and they created a glory for themselves. And here it's things like man and birds and animals and reptiles, or it could be skyscrapers or rockets to the moon or computers or art or anything but having to go outside of ourselves and what we can create and what we can do and what we can control, and make that the treasure of our lives and that our source of joy. So I think the essence of sin is all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, or lack the glory of God, in the sense that they have examined it, rejected it, and embraced other things as preferable to God. Money, sex, power, house, family, job, vacations, games, retreats, you name it, all innocent idols. And sin is simply the lifestyle that follows once you've done that, or sinning, or sins. Now, if that's right, if I'm on the right track in my definition of sin, the schizophrenia should be obvious. On this side of the brain, you've got God saying, the most valuable thing in the universe is my glory. I love my glory. I am righteous. I will uphold my glory in the honor of my name. And on this side of the brain, you have God saying, I will choose sinners and love them and care for them and accept them and justify the ungodly. I will elect them. Now, that tension runs through the whole Old Testament, crying out for some kind of harmony in the mind of God. Question number 2 asks for the other image I use besides schizophrenia to get at this thing. And the other image is a symphony or music piece. That's what I'm after here. And I'm no musician, but the little bit I remember from the one music appreciation course that I took, this is very dangerous, the little bit I remember is that one of the marks of great music is that it's not simple. Simple music is good and fine, and we need simple music, but great music tends to have complexities about it. Meaning that as it develops, there are movements and strains and parts that seem to go away from each other, and you're listening and you're trying to figure out where is this going. And then the greatness of it, at least until modern days and the glorification of cacophony, the greatness of it was that it finds some resolution. It finds some resolution. Now, the symphony of history is not quite over yet. And there's a lot of discord in the universe as we're listening to it. But as the music was being played for several thousand years, there came a crescendo with the coming of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ came, and something in this music happened so that those who know music, who have the Spirit, who are listening, can say, oh, I get it. I see the resolution. I see how it's all going to come together. I see how he's not a schizophrenic, how there's not really cacophony in the moral universe. Oh, I see. Because that's the function of the cross. It's the coming together of the clashing themes of the symphony of redemptive history. Namely, the theme of God's love for his glory and his righteousness, and the theme of God's compassion on sinners and his acceptance of sinners and his mercy on sinners. And these two themes are running in and out of each other, and you get horrendous words of judgment and strong statements of God's righteousness in the Old Testament, and you get incredible words of patience and kindness and mercy in the Old Testament. And you wonder, what in the world? How can he be like this? Where does it all come together? What's the common thing? How does it? And suddenly the music comes together in the cross. Now, I haven't thought too much here in my notes about this, but my understanding of history is that when Christ came, it was the beginning of the resolution of the symphony, not the end of the resolution. It was the first time, as it were. Well, that's not quite accurate either. It was the decisive and clearest time when you saw and heard expressed in the symphony the resolution. Then all of a sudden it's moving out again. And so we're living right now, I think, in a lot of discord. I don't think you need to be ashamed of that. As a person who believes in the sovereignty of God and the composer of the universe and the drama and the symphony of the universe, you don't need to bull back and say, well, there really isn't any discord in the world. You don't need to do that. You don't need to blind yourself to pain and horror and tragedy and misery, because they're real. But the harmony has been sounded. So that's number two. And then I think I've already given the answer to number three as well. What is the central event in redemptive history that brings harmony and integrated wholeness to the apparent schizophrenia in God's ways? And the answer is the death and the resurrection of Jesus. I'm just using schizophrenia as a picture of a tension between two things in the mind of God that is coming to resolution. So I'm going to wind up saying that God and Jesus are the most harmonious and healthy of all minds. Let me do this now. Let me take you into Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is absolutely amazing. You read this and you say, why aren't all of our friends over Temple Israel Christians? Why aren't all Jews converted? Good night. What do they do with Isaiah 53? So we want to jump in here and let the sign and the wonder that it is prophecy, 700 years before it happened, and yet is doctrinally so profound about the meaning of the death of the Messiah, Jesus, have its full effect upon us. Now the question I pose in number 4 is a key verse in foreshadowing the great event of resolution between this schizophrenia, of the apparent schizophrenia, is Isaiah 53:10. Here's that verse. The Lord was pleased to bruise him. He has put him to grief, or caused his pain. When he makes himself an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Now that verse is just packed with incredible truth about Jesus who was to come. So there are three things I say let's talk about. What verses do I use in the context of Isaiah 53 to show, one, what does bruise mean? B, what does prolong his days mean? Does it mean rise from the dead? And where do I get that? And C, what does offspring mean? And where do I get that? People coming to be saved through him. So let's just find the verses and see whether they in fact teach what I'm suggesting those three phrases mean. Now the first one, bruising. What is bruise? Does bruise mean that this person died? That it was the good pleasure of God that this person die? Look at verse 8. Isaiah 53. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living? So there's my first argument. Yes, it does mean die. He was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. Look at verse 12. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because, here it comes, he poured out his soul to death. All right. Is that enough to justify my interpretation of the bruising as killing, dying? This person foretold here in this chapter is one who dies. And he dies according to the Lord's will. Now, second question. Does the fact that it says in verse 10 that he shall prolong his days, he shall see the offspring, he shall prolong his days, does that mean he'll rise from the dead and live forever? That's what I think it means. Let's see whether or not that's the case. Verse 12 again. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he died. Because he poured out his soul to death. Now, how do you construe that? I'm going to give him a portion with the great, and he'll divide the spoil, and he's already dead. There's only one, I think there's only one way to handle that. Namely, he's not going to stay dead. He's going to rise, and he's going to have a spoil given to him because of his victory. So verse 12 is my reason for construing the prolong his days in verse 10 as he comes back to life after he dies. And he lives forever. Now the third is, what does offspring mean in verse 10? He shall see his offspring. And I suggested in the question that it means people coming to be justified or saved, forgiven through his death. Now let's look at verse 11. He shall see the fruit of his travail, the travail of his soul, and be satisfied. So there's going to be fruit from the suffering of his soul, and it's going to be fruit that satisfies him. What is that? By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, that's Jesus, that's the Messiah, make many to be accounted righteous. That's justification by faith. That's justification, counting people righteous who aren't righteous. And he shall bear their iniquities. That's the foundation of it all. So, I'm satisfied that those verses justify the interpretation of verse 10 that bruise him means kill him or put him to death, and prolong his days means he won't stay dead. He will come back to life and have long days. Now we know forever. I was just reading in Romans 6 this week, where it says, we know that death no longer has dominion over him. He cannot die again. So now we know with further revelation that these prolonged days are forever. And we know now that offspring that he will get through his dying and rising are people who are made or counted righteous because he bore their iniquities. Any question or comment about those three things? Yeah, that's the problem. How can you show mercy to somebody like that when he's an idolater? He's just as bad as everybody else. And here you are, he looks up and it says in Genesis 15:6 that he justified him by his faith because he believed the promise. So he just justifies him. He just wipes his slate clean and says, fine, you're going to have life with me and I'll forgive all your sins. That's the problem. That's not the solution. I think that the Old Testament saints lived with a tremendous sense of a future where something was going to happen that would make sense out of their whole law. The law was a shadow of things to come, and I think those who were most godly knew it most deeply. They felt in their hearts the provision that has been made for our forgiveness in this blood system, in the tabernacle, is a wonderful thing, and I am so glad that God has ordained it to be. But this will not ultimately vindicate the righteousness of God. A ram taking my place as a man who has offended against the living God will never cut it. Hebrews says the blood of bulls and goats can never take away sin. Now, I think they knew that in their hearts, and yet all they could do was say, well, he's going to do something. It's coming. And then you get texts like this and Psalm 22, and there are these foreshadowings that there's a suffering one coming.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Light and Truth, where we are committed to providing God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. On our next episode, John Piper concludes our two-part series, How the Cross Makes Sense of God, with a teaching titled, The Cross Proves God is Just. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.